Greetings Guzzlers. We're going to do a little bit of baking. Now we're going to make a sort of semi-unleavened bread. It's not actually a properly unleavened bread because we're putting yeast in it, which is traditional. Okay, this is a traditional bread that effectively dates back to biblical times. We're going to make some taboon. Now the word taboon actually has two meanings, if you like. One is the bread that we're going to make, but the reason it's called taboon is because it is traditionally baked in a taboon oven, which I haven't got. You might see over there some stones, and we'll come to that shortly. So it's quite a simple bread. Okay, I've got half a teaspoon of yeast, half a teaspoon of sugar, I've got about 60-70 mils of warm water, and then I've got 400 mils of water that we'll add later. I've got 160 grams of spelt flour and 160 grams of sort of plain white flour, and then I've got a teaspoon of salt and half a teaspoon of olive oil, and that's all we're going to use. So the first thing we want to do is start the yeast off. So I'm going to add sugar, the yeast, and that small amount of warm water into a bowl, and then we're just going to give that a mix together, and we're going to let that stand for about 10 minutes to make sure that the yeast has got going. Now, I said to you about this Taboon oven. It was a traditional, from the Near East, from Jordan, places like that, a traditional terracotta oven that was used not just to bake bread, but also to bake other dishes. And depending where in this oven you placed your bread or your dishes, depending how long it took to cook. Okay, now this taboon bread is often used as an accompaniment, or it can be used as a main ingredient. And actually the reason I'm cooking this is because I'm going to use this in a Palestinian dish that I'm making shortly. Okay, but it can be used for other things. And actually the dish that I'm making in a way sort of relies on the fact that it's been cooked in this traditional taboon oven. Now it's a little bit like a tandoori type bread. Okay, it resembles a bit of a pita bread, but though pita bread, when you cook it, tends to like inflate. I mean, you know, when you normally get it, it's deflated, but the taboon bread doesn't traditionally inflate. And probably to prove me wrong, I'll probably bloody well do so. But anyway, and like I said, this goes back to biblical times. In the Near East, it was quite a traditional oven. It was used sometimes as like a community oven. Okay, and traditionally it would, well, I like your word traditionally at the moment, and I'm using that a lot. It would be fired up at sunrise and sunset, and often it would use, well actually because this bread coordinated with the olive oil season, they would often use, as part of the fuel, which would be animal dung and stuff like that, they would also use the olive wood that they'd extracted the olive oil from. So that's my yeast gone stand. We're now just going to have a little pause for about 10 minutes, and then we'll make the dough up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add about half of the flour. So we've got two different flours, you remember. So I'm just going to add about half of each together into the bowl, just to do our initial mixing. Okay, I'll make a little well in the middle, and I'll just add that yeast mixture in, and I've got the oil in that's going to go, and the salt, and then just going to get that mixed in until that's sort of blended together, and then what we'll do is gradually start adding in the rest of the flour and some of that water. Now, we don't want it being a really sticky dough, but obviously, you know, we want it a dough that we can work with. So we'll add sort of as much water as we need, so that we don't go too far. Now, I was saying to you about these traditional Taboon oven. It was terracotta, I think I said, and it was in a cone shape. And it sort of had like a stony bottom. So when you cooked your bread, the bread went onto that stony bottom, and as a result, the bread, it sort of should have like a textured surface, and that added to the appearance of the bread, if you like, which made it useful in a particular sort of dish, like the Palestinian dish that I'm intended to use it with, whereby it meant like the juices and that could sit in these little dents in the bread, if you like. So because Taboon ovens sort of disappeared from, you know, those areas of the Middle East like Jordan and Lebanon and places like that, you can recreate it. I mean, you can the very simplest way. If you've got a pizza stone, you can heat that up in the oven and cook it on a pizza stone. But you then wouldn't get that traditional sort of texture. So what you do instead is you go out and you get a selection of river stones. Now, by that I presume they mean like pebbles. So I've got a selection of pebbles here. Now, I think they're meant to be a little bit more even in size, but these were the best I could find in my garden. And I've given them a thorough good scrubbing and wash. And what we will do, not yet, because this needs time to rise, and we need a good couple of hours for this to rise, we'll put this in the oven on a very high heat, at least sort of 240, 250, and get them hot, and then we will slap our bread down onto that, and it shouldn't take too long to cook. Like I say, the heat that was retained by this Taboon oven meant that bread, these sort of loaves, if you like, because they're flatbreads, maximum 10 minutes, and that was flipping them over. So that in a way sort of tells you about the Taboon oven and the Taboon bread. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get this to a nice sort of firm dough. Doesn't matter if it's a little bit sticky, but we don't want it runny, and we obviously want it so that we're able to knead it. We're going to knead it for about 10 minutes, okay. I might add some more of that water in a minute. At the moment, I'm not sure I've quite incorporated that, but what I'll do, I should go and then I should knead that for 10 more minutes, and then what we will do is we'll just leave it in the bowl somewhere in a warm place, covered over with a tea cloth or whatever, for a couple of hours to rise. And then at which point we'll be wanting to put our oven on to get that up to temperature, get them stones up to temperature, so that we can then bake our loaves. Now this should make around about 4 to 5 loaves, so I might go for 5, so that we've got one to try out. So there's the dough, knocked it back a little bit, and I've got just over 500 grams there. So what I'm going to do, because I want to make 5 loaves, I'm going to divide this up into approximate 100, that was a bit small, 100 gram pieces, Oops. Oh, forgot to take one off. Of course. That's a bit weird. That one's double the size of the other one. And then remember to take it off. Right, so they're slightly bigger, but we'll have a small one for a taster. So what we now do is we just roll these into balls, and we're just going to then let these rest for about 10 minutes. Now we roll these out by hand, right? As in flatten them out by hand. We don't use a rolling pin. You could if you wanted, I suppose. My tray of stones, my baking tray with stones has gone in. Like I said, you could use a pizza stone, okay? With a pizza stone, you might want to do it for like 4 or 5 minutes on each side. In a traditional Taboon oven, don't necessarily need to flip it, but we'll see how it cooks on these stones. So my oven's on, I put it up to maximum. Okay, so we're going to get that nice and hot, and we're going to just let these rest 10 minutes. So the oven's up to temperature, and what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to flatten this out, roughly circular. Okay, now bear in mind this is the small bit. Okay, what we want is really about 1/4 inch thick and as big as you can get it for that size. So I'm going to stick with that because it's got a bit thin in places, so that's probably not going to work really well. But we'll cook that one off first. So that's that thin one out. Now normally what would happen is the upper surface starts looking a little bit charred in a proper Taboon oven, and the edges do as well. So you can replicate that by turning it on your gas, and then simply passing this briefly over the flame just to char it a bit. Unfortunately, because that one was a bit thin, it has crumbled a little bit, so I'm not going to try and char that much more. But it is, like I said, it doesn't sort of inflate like a pita bread was. It has a, I'm trying to think just what to taste it. It's got an almost slightly sourish taste to it, but doesn't really taste much different, apart from it's bloody hot, from pita bread. It's a little bit salty. Like I say, a little bit difficult because this was a bit too thin, but you can see the texture surface, and so that is your traditional Taboon. And like I say, I'll cook these because the main 4 I'm going to be using in a dish that traditionally has a Taboon as a base.